Hello, everybody. I am Michael Curtis, the Director of Product Development for Dungeon Crawl Classics. Welcome to the next installment of the Maw of Mike for YouTube, which is an ongoing series of short videos intended to introduce you to the fantastic game that is Dungeon Crawl Classics. Each one of these videos is going to dive into one aspect of the game, and they're intended to educate, entertain, and hopefully make you want to try out DCC if you haven't already. Last time, I gave you a broad overview on DCC role-playing game and what makes it different from other fantasy RPGs already currently out there. Kind of taking that, this time I want to talk about the core mechanic and what we call the dice chain, which are the two central rules that you need to know to play Dungeon Crawl Classics, and how they're not all that different from what you probably already know. So buckle in, it should be a short and sweet one, and I bet you're already halfway there. All right, so what is the core mechanic of Dungeon Crawl Classics? If you have played any fantasy RPG in the last 25 years or so, you probably already know the core mechanic of DCC. Like in other D20 powered role-playing games, the core mechanic of Dungeon Crawl Classics involved determining the difficulty of a task, assigning that task a difficulty class, what we also call a DC, and then trying to roll equal to or higher to that DC on a die, usually a D20. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? So in some cases, the DC might be set already. It might be like a monster's armor class in the stat block. The judge looks at the monster in the rule book and says, okay, this goblin wears chainmail. It has a armor class of 15. You already know that 15 is going to be the number you need to hit, and you need to roll in order to hit the monster. Sometimes the difficulty class is determined more on the fly, depending on how difficult the task you're trying to accomplish is. For something that's really simple, like trying to walk across a log, big broad log, on a sunny day, the DC might be 5, for example. But something truly heroic, something that is a mighty heroic action, like bend the bars or grab the magic item out of the hand of the evil dragon, that might have a DC 20 in order to succeed on. So now, in most cases, in a lot of role-playing games and in Dungeon Crawl Classics, you basically have a pass-fail. You either hit that DC or you do not. But there are cases in Dungeon Crawl Classics where might get a range of results. And the number one example of this is when you cast spells. I'll be talking about spell casting in a later video, but what you might need to know now, for example, is that when you cast a first level spell in Dungeon Crawl Classics, you're going to make a spell check, and you need to get a minimum of 12 on your spell check in order for the spells to succeed. However, the higher you roll, the more powerful these spells effect become. So if you roll a 12 with a sleep spell, you might put one person to sleep. If you roll a 20 with a sleep spell, you might put 50, 8 people to sleep. If you roll a 30 on a spell check, on a sleep spell check, you might put an entire small nation to sleep for 100 years. That's the way the DCC rolls. Now, so as I said, once you know the DCC, you roll a die, apply any applicable modifiers, and then compare the final result to the established DC in order to see if you succeed. Pretty simple, right? As I said, bet you already knew what the core mechanic was, even if you've never even seen the Dungeon Crawl Classics rulebook, let alone open it. So now that you know the dice chain, we're going to talk about how we modify now that you know the core mechanic, we're going to talk about how we modify the core mechanic. And the way we do that is what are called the dice chain and funky dice in Dungeon Crawl Classics. Now, for example, in D&D, there uses advantage and disadvantage, which has you rolling 2 d20s and taking either the better or the worse results. If you're in a situation where circumstances are to your benefit, you take the better one. If they're a hindering circumstance, you would take the worst result. It's a good mechanic, but it's not what DCC does. Instead, DCC uses what we call the dice chain. And if you watched the first video in the series, you might recall that I mentioned that Dungeon Crawl Classics uses odd dice like a D7 or a D16 or even a D30, in addition to the standard 7 dice that most RPG gamers out there are already familiar with. And the reason we do this is because of that dice chain. So in Dungeon Crawl Classics, when circumstances are either favorable or hindering you, instead of applying like a static modifier, like, oh, it's a -4 penalty, or you roll multiple dice and you take a different result depending on, what the circumstances are, DCC bumps you up and down the dice chain. So, for example, if you're in circumstances where you have an advantage in combat, say, I have the high ground, everybody knows the high ground is always the place you want to be. Your die size will be increased by a step. So what that means is that instead of rolling a d20 when you're making that attack roll, you roll a d24. See where it's going? Likewise, if you're trying to, say, fight your way up that same muddy hill to get that person who has the high ground and is driving rain on top of you, you might have to make an agility check to do so. But because of the circumstances, you might have the die size reduced by a step, meaning that instead of a d20, you would roll a d16. Now, and unlike advantage and disadvantage, the dice chain does stack. So if you have two beneficial conditions like affecting a roll, you have the high ground and you have, magic sword, or, you're blessed or something, you could bump the dice chain up 2 sizes instead of the 1. So in this case, you would roll a d30 to attack. And there's nothing like rolling a d30 to swing a sword at somebody. And it's a lot of fun because that die rolled forever. And, it's nothing like hitting somebody with I've got a 33, which we have my strength modifier rate. Okay. Alternately, you could have 2 effects which are hindering you, and so that would reduce your die by 2 steps. But there could be a circumstance where you have something benefiting you, so you would bump it down 2 dice size. And that would put it to, say it was a d20, you'd knock it down to a d14. But you might have something that is beneficial, and that would bump it back up 1 size. So you would roll a d16. So it can slide up and down the dice chain. It's very fluid, very quick to pick up. DCC also uses your standard kind of normal +1, -1 modifiers, especially when it comes to like ability scores. But the dice chain is basically the central way of how modifying die rolls, and it's a fun one to boot. So you should also know that the die chain doesn't just apply to d20s. It doesn't attack rolls, saving throws, ability checks, all the rest of that stuff. You might also find like a magic sword that does increased damage against certain monsters, and maybe it'll bump up the die size by 2 dice. So instead of rolling a d8, you're rolling, say, a d12. Or you could fight something that's resistant to like non-magical attacks, and maybe you have a -2 die chain modifier, bump down 2 sides. So your d6, short sword is now doing d4 because it would go d6 to d5 to d4. So that's how it works. I mean, the possibilities are literally endless and very quick to apply to any DCC game event, whatsoever. So DCC, as I said, we do use the funky dice. Which, for the record, that's a D3, a D5, a D7, a D14, D16, D24, and D30. But you don't necessarily need one of these. The rulebook explains how to generate dice results in these ranges using just your standard, 7 RPG dice that you probably already have. But I bet you that once you get a game or 2 of DCC under your belt, you're going to want some funky dice of your area. So that's it. As I said, you probably already knew more about DCC than you already do, and I hope you think that the dice chain is pretty cool, because we do. So that's it for this one. Next up, we'll be starting to get into the nitty-gritty about DC. We start talking about the classes and character creation and other cool stuff. So hope to see you back here when I get those down. And until the meantime, stay awesome. I'm out of here. Bye-bye.